I woke up to a loud crash, followed by my grandma claiming someone was in the house. I found black sludge everywhere instead. I devote the majority of my awake hours to caring for my elderly grandmother, who is afflicted with Alzheimer's disease, which has steadily taken more from her. I do not engage in tasks that necessitate advanced medical expertise. A nurse visits the house 2 times a week to handle that aspect. I have no medical training aside from a CPR course I completed a few months ago for emergencies, yet I have a sinking feeling that I am already losing touch with the basics as the days go by. I do not mind looking after her. My grandma welcomed me into her home when I was 11 years old after my parents separated. Neither of them truly wanted to raise a child. That much was obvious from the start. I believe my mother cared for me, but she was never suitable to be a parent, and she recognized it. My father, conversely, was never capable of being around children, let alone caring for one himself. He was frequently in and out of prison. Before my grandmother took me in, my happiest memories of childhood occurred during my father's times in jail. Life was tolerable when it was just my mother and me. However, whenever he returned from imprisonment, everything always fell apart again. When my parents finally divorced, I felt as despondent as a child could possibly feel. The joyful light of childhood innocence had long vanished from my perception. Everything transformed when I moved in with my grandma. Her house was spacious and tidy, situated on an expansive piece of land. I had my own room and more than just 2 outfits to wear. I thought we must have been wealthy. Though caring for me added to her financial struggles, she never showed any signs of it on her face. That woman constantly wore a smile. I wish that smile would return. Since the onset of the disease's grip on her, she primarily sits and stares. On good days, she permits me to care for her, and we spend meaningful time enjoying novels and her black and white television programs. However, on bad days, she refuses all assistance. I do not fully grasp what triggers these reactions, but some mornings, she wakes up feeling paranoid and fearful. Day one Sunday, my alarm rang at 5:55 a.m. What on earth? I thought. I always program my alarm for 9:00 a.m. Although many elderly individuals appreciate waking up before dawn, my grandma will sleep the entire day if I let her. My routine typically starts at 9:00, where I prepare myself, make breakfast, and then help grandma out of bed by 10:00. So why was my alarm sounding at 5:55? I switched it off and rolled over, attempting to fall back asleep. But before I could, I heard a crash from upstairs. I reside in the basement, while grandma occupies the master bedroom on the main floor. I hurried out of my room and dashed up the stairs as fast as I could. Was grandma injured? Did she fall? What on earth was she doing out of bed? My thoughts raced. When I reached the top of the stairs, I anticipated seeing my grandmother on the floor, but instead, I found an empty living room. The sun had not yet risen, rendering the room only slightly visible. I peeked into the master bedroom and found grandma still deeply asleep. I quietly closed the door, ensuring I did not wake her. With grandma safe in her room, I opted to investigate the house to identify the source of the crash. The kitchen appeared normal, aside from a knife in the sink, which I was fairly certain I had cleaned and put away the night before. Next, I checked the living room and spotted a book on the floor. I maintain a tidy environment so grandma does not trip on anything, so it was indeed unusual to find the book lying in the middle of the room. I picked it up and opened it. It was a scrapbook, one of many that my grandmother had compiled over the years. This particular scrapbook predominantly featured photographs of my mother during her youth. After closing the book, I walked a few feet to the bookshelf and placed it back in its usual spot, where dust had betrayed its resting place. I still felt somewhat drowsy, and in my weary state, I convinced myself that my grandma had been looking at it previously and left it on the floor without my noticing. That is the nature of the human mind. We do anything to justify the inexplicable. Remembering it was still early and realizing I had approximately 3 hours before I needed to start my day, I sneaked out of the house for a quick jog. I usually do not leave my grandmother alone, but she wouldn't be waking up for quite a while, and it felt refreshing to have a moment to myself. I returned home half an hour later. As I entered the bathroom, I received a text from my girlfriend Jane. She works at a bakery and always messages me before her shift, though I typically do not respond for a few hours since, as I mentioned earlier, I am never up this early. The text read, Good morning, Paul. I'm heading to work, but maybe I can stop by afterward and hang out for a while. I smiled and decided to surprise her by replying right away. Enjoy work? I love you. Wow. You're up early, she replied. Yeah, I was jolted awake by a loud noise and decided to get a head start on my day. I omitted the detail about my alarm ringing 3 hours too early. When it was time to wake Grandma, I entered her bedroom gently and switched on the light, only to my surprise, Grandma was already awake. She sat at the foot of her bed, gazing at me, but this time not with her usual blank stare, rather with evident fear. Hey, Grandma, what's wrong? I inquired. She remained silent, continuing to stare at me. Deciding to grant her some space while confirming she was safe, I proceeded to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. As I glanced into the sink, ready to wash the knife I had forgotten about the previous night, it was gone. I figured I had been mistaken when I noticed it earlier. A window above the kitchen sink offered a lovely view of the yard. As I gazed out, a bluebird fluttered by and landed on the back porch. The beautiful bird seemed almost misplaced in our little backyard. I had never seen a bird like that in our area. Turning around, I nearly jumped out of my skin as I saw my grandmother just inches away from my face. Goodness, Grandma. My initial fear quickly shifted to laughter as I chuckled. You almost scared me to death. Are you feeling any better? She still held that frightened and angry expression. It was almost as if, Hey, Grandma, I said with unease. You know who I am, right? It's me, Paul, your grandson. In a hushed tone, she replied without breaking eye contact. There's someone in the house. A wave of profound guilt washed over me as I responded. No, Grandma, you know me. I live here with you, remember? Her anger transformed into disappointment. Leaning closer to my face, she whispered, No, Paul, I know who you are. I'm telling you that someone is in our house. My heart plummeted, and the guilty knot in my stomach transformed into a void of dread. Grandma, where did you see this person? My God, are they still here? I instantly believed her, as I always had, but for a moment I wondered, is this the disease? Is she hallucinating? I didn't recall the doctor mentioning anything about hallucinations. I forced myself to push those thoughts aside. I reached for my phone to call for help, but Grandma grasped my hand before I could unlock it. He's in my room. She mentioned it almost as an afterthought. My heart raced, and without considering, I lifted her up and hurried to the front door. Once outside, I set her down on the porch bench. Stay here, I urged. She wouldn't meet my gaze. I rushed back into the house and made my way to her bedroom. The door was closed. I reached for the handle, but hesitated. Adrenaline had propelled me this far, but it seemed to dissipate when I was faced with confronting whatever was inside. What would I even do if I encountered someone? I pondered, but I needed to ensure our safety. Slowly turning the knob, I stepped inside. Everything appeared normal, aside from a bit of chaos. Hadn't I tidied her room up the night prior? I searched thoroughly but found no signs of anyone. Relief washed over me, and I almost smiled at how worked up I had been. That feeling faded immediately as I recalled the master bathroom, the door still closed. I swung the door open, but what I witnessed didn't frighten me. It left me bewildered. The walls, mirror, and floor were coated in a thick black sludge. The smell reminded me of many hot summer afternoons spent walking along empty roads as a child. It was the scent of tar and tobacco. After standing there for what felt like minutes in shock, I checked the rest of the house but found nothing amiss. I walked outside and found Grandma still seated on the bench. Her focus had shifted to a small group of ants on the pavement. Hey, Grandma, I checked the house. There's no one here. She offered no response. Did something occur in the bathroom? What caused that mess? Still silence. I wasn't fully convinced there had been an intruder, yet I wasn't entirely sure my grandmother had created the chaos herself. The remainder of the day slipped by quickly. Grandma hadn't said a word to me since the incident, but honestly, I hadn't had the mental capacity for conversation either. Cleaning the sludge was an arduous task. It took me deep into the afternoon to scrub away the black stain. The tar was initially warm to the touch but soon dried completely, turning hard and resistant to my efforts. I lost track of time until I heard a knock at the door. Jane. I sprinted to the door and opened it to see her smiling face. Jane, I'm so sorry I forgot you were visiting. She appeared disappointed. Oh, sorry. Should I go? I should have sent a reminder text that I was coming over. No, please, come inside. I apologize. I just feel terrible that I haven't showered or prepared dinner or anything. I've been so preoccupied today. How is Grandma doing? She asked. It's been a tough day for her. She understood what I meant. I had often confided in her about Grandma's previous bad days. She recognized how quiet and off Grandma could seem when her mind wasn't functioning optimally. "Aw, Granny," she said, directing a sympathetic expression toward Grandma. She truly cared for my grandmother. We ordered Chinese food, and I recounted the day's events to Jane. "That's so strange," she exclaimed between bites of orange chicken. "Where do you think she got the black substance?" "I have no idea. I'm not even 100% convinced it was her. I mean, who knows? Maybe someone was in our house. I did notice a few things seemed out of place." We sat in silence for a few moments, then diverted our attention to a black and white film we had turned on for Grandma. Eventually, the evening began to feel normal again. After the movie, I tucked Grandma into bed before Jane, and I settled on the couch to watch a program featuring actual color and cuddled together. Day 2 Monday, my alarm roused me at 5:55 a.m. I glanced at my phone, puzzled that it had gone off again. Before I had a chance to return to bed, a loud crash from upstairs startled me. I was on my feet instantly. This noise was considerably louder than the previous days. I dashed up the stairs and peeked into Grandma's room. She was sleeping. Stepping back into the living room, I found the same scrapbook on the floor. I flicked all the lights on. Once the room was sufficiently bright, I opened the scrapbook. A sinister feeling crept into my bones as I turned page after page. Every picture that included my mother had been defaced, her face cut out from each photo. I called the police, and the operator assured me they would arrive quickly. I was convinced that someone had been in the house. While waiting for the authorities, I woke Grandma and guided her out to my car, where she sat as I thoroughly searched the house. In the 6 minutes it took the police to get there, I noticed a kitchen drawer left open. I also discovered more black goo in the garage. The officers walked through the house, inspecting every nook and cranny where someone might hide. They found no one and no signs of forced entry. "It sounds like someone might be seeking to harm your mother, given her face was cut out of all the pictures," said one officer. "Well, if someone is out to get her, they must have the wrong house. We haven't seen her in nearly 17 years, I responded. The officers offered to check in on us later that night to ensure there was no suspicious activity around the property and instructed us to reach out if there were further disturbances. "Thank you, officers," I said, ushering Grandma back into the house as they drove away. "You okay, Grandma?" I asked. No response. We entered the living room, and as I assisted her on the couch, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned to face the kitchen window. That same bluebird from the previous day was staring right at me. The bird was remarkably beautiful, but as I gazed at it, I could not shake the feeling that I was in some sort of peril, as if it were an ill omen. It continued to stare for a few moments before taking flight. The day stretched on painfully. Grandma had not uttered a word. Even worse, she had not looked me in the eyes. I felt anxious. As the sun sank below the horizon, darkness enveloped the space. Time to settle Grandma in for the night. As I helped her get comfortable, she gazed at me. It was a much-awaited surprise, and I smiled back, but she didn't return the gesture. She merely whispered, "Someone is in the kitchen." Ice coursed through my veins. "What, Grandma, we were just in there and I didn't see anyone." She looked utterly terrified. Clearly, my words offered no solace. She simply repeated, "In the kitchen, the kitchen, kitchen." Then she turned away, closed her eyes, and ceased speaking. I was genuinely starting to feel uneasy, and I could not determine whether to believe her or not. I exited the room and headed for the kitchen. Upon my arrival, nothing appeared out of the ordinary at first, except for the drawer that contained plastic bags and wraps, which was again ajar. I turned to exit and switched off the light, but the room remained illuminated. I flicked the switch again, but the light persisted, getting progressively brighter. Panicking, I did the first thing that entered my mind and grabbed a large knife from the block, but I froze when I realized the knife block was empty. Sweat poured down my brow as I saw all the knives resting in the sink. The room continued to brighten intensely as I quickly retrieved a knife, cutting my hand on one of the smaller blades while trying to bandage the wound with a rag. Just then, the room went completely silent, and I saw it a massive figure, perhaps 8 feet tall. The shape was entirely naked, save for a layer of plastic wrapping stretched over it. The light radiating from the figure seemed to narrow my focus, blurring the environment around me. I could not discern its face as it was entirely concealed by the plastic, but I sensed a protrusion indicating where the nose lay beneath. Frozen with fright, my blood turned to ice. I was so terrified that I couldn't move. Dread enveloped me like molasses pouring into a glass, impeding my thoughts. I dropped the knife, which clattered loudly on the tile floor. I wanted to flee, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I remained transfixed on this luminous entity, and just when I thought it might attack, it started to talk. "Fear not, sweet boy." Its voice sounded frail and weak, as if trying to reassure me of my safety. It reminded me of how an elderly person might converse with a child, almost imitating their innocent tone. It continued, "Sweet Paul. Sweet Paul." "Who are you?" I managed to utter in a quivering voice. "Sweet Paul, I am your guardian angel, your guide through darkness, your friend from above." I wasn't convinced. An angel? This figure appeared demonic. It was the stuff of my nightmares. "Okay. Well, I'm okay, actually. I don't require a guardian angel." Suddenly, the creature began to breathe heavily, and in a deeper, more menacing voice it declared, "Yes, my sweet boy, you do." At that moment, the knives in the sink rocketed into the air, puncturing the ceiling. The sound startled me, and I turned to witness the knives dangling. With my gaze briefly averted from the creature, I immediately heard footsteps rushing toward me. I screamed and spun back to confront the monster. Raising my arms to shield my face, I braced for impact, but it never arrived. I opened my eyes to discover a dark, empty room. It was gone, and I was utterly alone. I hastily turned on the light and attempted to call Jane. It went directly to voicemail. She must have been asleep. With no one to speak to, I paced around my room until fatigue overwhelmed me, and I collapsed into bed. Day 3, Tuesday, the following day, my alarm activated at 5:55 a.m. This time, I was prepared. I raced up the stairs before any noise could alert me, hoping to catch the creature that had been tormenting us. I began my investigation by checking on Grandma. Asleep. Good, I thought as I closed her door and redirected my focus to the rest of the house. The first thing I noticed was the scrapbook positioned on the floor, its pages torn out and scattered everywhere. I needed to clean this up before my grandmother had a chance to discover the pitiful state of her cherished photo album, but that would have to wait until I had thoroughly searched the house. Next, I proceeded to the kitchen. Nothing appeared overly amiss, but I did notice one knife still lodged in the ceiling while the rest lay scattered on the floor. I intended to check the remainder of the house when I heard a loud slam reverberating from the basement. The noise was louder than on previous days, and I was convinced it had woken Grandma, so I resolved to check on her again before investigating. As I suspected, Grandma sat upright when I entered. She had not turned to acknowledge me upon my entry. "You okay, Grandma?" I asked. I was not anticipating a response given her near silence in recent days. Contrary to my expectations, she immediately answered, "It's okay, Paul. They can't harm us today. Hank will protect us." Hank had been my grandfather, who passed away over 20 years ago. I lacked the heart to remind her of his death, so I remained silent and approached the stairs. Just as I commenced my descent, the loud banging noise reoccurred, sending a chill coursing down my spine. I moved to take the next step but felt frozen for several moments. Gathering my courage, I proceeded toward the basement. Apart from my room, there were 2 additional rooms downstairs, a guest bedroom and a family room that had gradually transformed into my personal sanctuary over the years. The noise surged for the 3rd time, evidently coming from the family room. I cautiously peeked through the door, but quickly retreated behind the wall. Instead of my non-angelic guardian angel, something far more terrifying loomed in the room. It was larger than the angel, possibly 10 feet tall. It had to hunch down to fit in the space. Rather than emitting light, the creature radiated an overwhelming darkness that appeared to clash with the soft moonlight streaming through the window. Its hands were disproportionately large for its body, featuring elongated bony fingers. The most remarkable attribute of this monster was its coating. From head to toe, the creature was drenched in hot black sludge, which dripped onto the floor. The intense chemical odor was nearly suffocating, and I found myself struggling not to retch as I silently observed the beast breathe. I shifted my weight, poised to take a closer look. But before I could peep around the corner, the monster let out a piercing scream, a sound reminiscent of both a man and a dog. I sprinted toward the staircase, casting a glance over my shoulder only to watch the creature move toward me with astonishing rapidity. Reaching the top of the stairs, I nearly bolted for the front door when I remembered Grandma still in her room. Thinking fast, I dashed behind the island counter in the kitchen, hiding and aiming to make as little noise as possible. I heard the tar monster reach the top of the stairs and pause. Thankfully, it seemed oblivious to my location but soon began searching for me. I caught a glimpse of it as its back was turned, and I observed it carrying something large. Is that a rug? I wondered. Suddenly, recognition set in. The creature was hauling my rug from beneath my coffee table. What on earth does it want with that? Redirecting my attention back to my hiding spot, I scanned for a potential weapon. As my gaze scoured the kitchen, I grew transfixed by the window, or more precisely, what lay beyond it, the little bluebird. Just then, I heard something crash onto the floor and I whipped around. The creature had vanished, and my rug lay unraveled in the living room. The rest of the day lingered in a daze. My head throbbed, and no dosage of acetaminophen could alleviate my suffering. Grandma remained confined to her room, only permitting me to enter for meals and to ensure she took her medication. By the time night fell, I yearned for some respite, but Jane arrived for dinner, and her infectious enthusiasm began to revitalize me. So, what did you accomplish today? Find any more misplaced objects? She innocently inquired. I had almost forgotten that I had not revealed to her the bizarre monsters I had encountered. I contemplated keeping this from her, but I could never deceive her. We had been friends since elementary school and together in high school. She was the one person I expected to believe in my crazy story. So I told her about the tar monster and the plastic angel from the previous night. After I finished, she stared at me, her jaw dropped. Oh my goodness, Paul, this is just like that show Ghost Adventures or something. A broad smile lit up her face, which was not the reaction I had anticipated. Maybe not exactly like Ghost Adventures, but it's quite eerie, I replied. We should set up some cameras and catch them the next time they show up. We could become famous. She genuinely seemed excited by the notion. I'd like to see how enthusiastic you feel when they show up in your kitchen. I shot back, beginning to smile myself. It's all right, Paul, I'll stay overnight to keep you safe, she offered. Don't you have to work tomorrow? I questioned. Nope. We're closed tomorrow, silly. I didn't voice it, but I felt immensely grateful not to spend the night alone anymore. I was becoming seriously spooked by my own home. Well, it's settled then, I told her. You can confront the sinister monsters, and I will indulge in some much-needed beauty rest. The remainder of the night unfolded rather normally. We watched a horror film at Jane's suggestion, what is her fascination with spooky content, and eventually went to sleep. That night, I had an incredibly strange dream about my mother. In the dream, I was young, perhaps around 7 or 8, and assisting her in mopping the kitchen. She taught me how to fill the bucket with water and how much soap to use. Handing me the mop, she said, "Give it a try." Eager to help, I nearly tripped over the mop as I swung it from side to side. We were cleaning up a spill, and I concluded perhaps I had accidentally spilled grape soda again. And then you dip it into the water again, she instructed. I plunged the mop into the bucket and was just about to pull it back when I noticed the water turning a light crimson. Confused, I glanced down at the floor I had just mopped and was horrified to see that the liquid I had been spreading over the tiles was a thick, shimmering pool of blood. I screamed and looked back to my mother for reassurance, only to stumble back over the bucket when I caught sight of her. Soaked in soap, water, and blood, I watched my mother stare at me with the biggest grin. Her head was bleeding profusely. I bolted upright in bed, woke from the nightmare. I must have been gasping for air because Jane sat up and began rubbing my back. Hey, what's the matter?" she asked. Catching my breath, I managed to chuckle a bit as I stated, I just had the strangest, most morbid dream. I was a kid, and my mother was allowing me to help with chores, but she was bleeding everywhere, and I think she was going to die. Jane persisted in comforting me and said, "That is bizarre. Your mom is fine, right? I mean, as far as we know." To be honest, I was uncertain about my mother's well-being. The last time I saw her was just before she went to rehab when I was 8. Since then, I had only communicated with her through letters. When I was 13, the letters ceased altogether. "I'm sure she's okay," I asserted, more for my own reassurance than for Jane's comfort. We fell back asleep, and I did not experience any additional strange dreams that night. Day 4 Wednesday, my alarm roused both Jane and me at 5:55 a.m. "Why did you set the alarm so early?" she asked, pulling a pillow over her ears. I turned off the alarm. "I didn't set it. It's just been sounding like this. There should be a loud noise, kind of like banging, any moment now." We sat in complete silence, waiting for something to occur. About 10 minutes passed and I began to feel relieved. "Maybe nothing will happen today," I suggested. Almost immediately afterward, we heard a scream erupting from upstairs. "Granny!" Jane shouted, and we both sprang into action. I stumbled slightly on the stairs, but quickly regained my footing as I crawled up the remaining steps with remarkable speed. When I reached Grandma's door, Jane was right behind me. I burst through the door, scanning for my grandmother. She was nowhere to be found. I rushed to her bed and checked beneath it, but there was nothing. We scoured every corner of the closet, the bathroom, the kitchen. Every location. She had just vanished. "Call the police. I'm going to drive around the neighborhood in case she left the house," I shouted. Jane began dialing 911, and I caught her relaying our address as I exited the house. I spent the next 15 minutes driving up and down the streets near home without a single sign of my grandma. Jane texted me, stating that the police had arrived, so I returned home. The officers re-examined the house and spoke into their radios about searching for a wandering and confused elderly woman. I explained to them that her screams sounded frightened, and I was concerned she might have been taken. They patiently listened to my narrative without making me appear insane, and when I finished, they informed me that the most likely scenario involved her leaving the house on her own. I refrained from arguing. I was aware of how my story might sound, and there was nothing I could say to convince them otherwise. Moreover, I genuinely hoped they were right. If Grandma had ventured out alone, as precarious as that would be, it would be better than if she had been abducted. The officers departed to look for Grandma, and as they drove away, I held Jane, who was weeping, into my shirt. The rest of the day was consumed with Jane and me searching every nook of town for her. When we grew weary from driving, we would return home and look again. We repeated this cycle until darkness fell, when we decided to retrace our steps the next day and let the police do their jobs. We remained in contact with them throughout the day, but they turned up with nothing. I was heartbroken and felt like crying, but I had withheld the tears all day. While I was not ashamed to cry in Jane's presence, I felt I needed all of my energy to focus on finding Grandma. I couldn't waste time crying. By the time we returned home, Jane had fallen asleep on the couch, utterly exhausted from the emotionally draining day. I stayed awake at my computer, designing a flyer to distribute throughout town the following day. I kept the ringer on my phone active to receive any updates from the police. Eventually, I began to drift off in my chair. The world blurred into fuzziness as my eyelids grew heavy, fluttering open a few times before succumbing to slumber. I was mere seconds from complete unconsciousness when I heard a voice whisper, "You don't remember, do you, sweet boy?" I jolted awake to see the plastic angel peering out from behind the sofa where Jane was sleeping. Its long fingers curled around the back of the couch. Jane," I managed to stammer. "Jane, wake up." She remained motionless. I knew she was a heavy sleeper, but come on, Jane. "You need to remember." The angel's voice echoed, shrill like nails on a chalkboard. "Remember what?" I inquired. "You need to remember, Paul, you were young, your mind could be easily shaped, but this was not the truth." The angel inched closer toward me as it continued, "You need to see what you were forced to forget." Once it reached my chair, it slowly raised its finger, which began to emit a light more brilliant than I had ever witnessed. The finger settled on my forehead, and I slipped into a deep sleep. 17 years ago, at the age of 8, my parents argued frequently. One summer, when my father returned home after his third stint in prison, he discovered that my mother was not handling their finances as she had in the past. She allocated more money for groceries and less for pills. She bought me new shoes and even took me to the movies once. This shift ignited relentless battles between them. Whenever they fought, I would sit outside our mobile home on a concrete slab and wait for the discord to cease. One day, I sat in the baking sun playing with a group of ants that had found a small splash of grape soda I had spilled. I let them crawl over my fingers and back onto the hot ground. The air was humid and thick, making it difficult to breathe. The yelling from inside grew unbearably loud, prompting me to stand up and wander aimlessly. I wasn't sure of my destination. I just longed to find a safe place. After walking for about half a mile, I noticed a girl sitting on a tire swing hanging from a solitary tree. I attempted to avoid making eye contact because I was 8, and girls were gross. As I strolled past, she called out, "Hey, kid." Caught off guard, I turned to see her beaming smile stretch from ear to ear. "Hi," I mumbled shyly. "Could you push me? I'm not very good at pumping my legs." It felt slightly odd, but I had nothing else to do. Since pushing a girl on a swing seemed more exciting than wandering, I decided to agree. "What's your name?" she inquired. "Paul," I replied, growing increasingly comfortable with her. "What's yours?" I added. "Jane," she stated matter-of-factly. We played for about an hour, and I figured it was probably time to return home. My parents disliked it when I was gone for too long. From that day on, whenever my parents fought, I'd head over to Jane's house, and we would take turns pushing each other on the old tire swing. On one particularly rainy day, my parents began another heated argument. I slipped on my rain boots and intended to fetch my coat, hoping to meet up with Jane. Perhaps we could find some sizable puddles to splash in, I thought. As I walked toward my bedroom, I heard my mother scream. It wasn't a scream born of anger that wouldn't have been unusual enough to grab my attention. It was a scream of agony. I dashed into the kitchen, where I saw my mother clutching her face, which was quickly changing to a dark hue. My father towered over her, rage blazing in his eyes. I was paralyzed by fear. I wanted to turn and flee, but terror kept me frozen in place, staring at the horrifying scene before me. Tears brimmed in my wide eyes as I looked from my mother to my father, then back to my mother. My dad turned to me and shouted, "You see, Paul, this is what occurs when you step out of line." I felt lifeless. I wanted to assist my mother. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay. I wanted to strike my father for hurting her. But most importantly, I yearned to scream. I wanted to scream more than anything else, but no sound would come. All that emerged was a whimper. My weeping only fueled my father's fury. He took a step toward me, but my mother shot upward from the ground like a bolt of lightning and lashed out at him, screaming, "Stay away from him, you monster." My father shoved her aside and prepared to strike her once more, but in that moment, my lungs finally released their suffocating grip, and I screamed, "Stop it." This surprised him, and as he turned to face me, my mother lunged for the knife block, withdrawing the largest knife. Before she could use it, my father grabbed her from behind and hurled her down. Her head struck the counter on the way to the floor. With a heavy thud, she landed motionless, and a pool of blood began to spread around her. "Oh no," my dad yelled, scrambling to cover her head in a futile attempt to staunch the bleeding. "No, no, no, no," his voice trailed off. As I observed the horror unfolding, my vision blurred, and my peripheral vision faded away, narrowing my focus on the crimson liquid escaping from my mother's skull. We remained silent. Minutes passed, then an hour. I dared not utter a syllable. Nothing in my 8-year-old mind could comprehend what had transpired. My mother never regained consciousness. After what felt like an eternity, my father managed to collect himself and stood over my mother, rifling through kitchen drawers. After a brief search, he located what he sought. He dropped to his knees beside my mother with a package of plastic wrap in hand. He lifted her head a few inches and meticulously wrapped the plastic around her head. He was meticulous, ensuring no blood could continue to seep from her wound. Once satisfied with his work, my mother resembled a glossy mannequin. He gently laid her head back down and exited the room, returning promptly with the rug from under our coffee table. He securely wrapped her up. He barked at me to fetch the mop, and soon I found myself cleaning the kitchen floor. I had to stand up to avoid him as he dragged my mother out of the kitchen and through the front door. He locked the deadbolt behind him, and moments later, I heard his truck start. He did not return for several hours. During his absence, I remained huddled in a corner of the kitchen, curled into a ball. The evening faded into night, and eventually, I fell asleep on the chilly kitchen tile. I awoke when he finally returned, moving cautiously. I glanced at the digital clock on the stove. 5:55 a.m. He was sweaty and fatigued and wore an expression of sorrow. He took a shower, dressed, and then summoned me to the living room. I obeyed, shuffling over until I found myself seated on the couch beside the man who had raised me. He sat in silence, lost in thought for what felt like an eternity. He eventually turned to me and said, "Powley, you know Mommy had to go away for a little while, right?" I stared at him, dumbfounded. He continued, "Mom has been battling some tough demons in recent months. She used a lot of drugs. You know she uses drugs, don't you? I nodded. I'd seen her on numerous occasions, high as she lay in bed for what seemed like days. I remained silent as he contemplated for a moment before explaining. Mom had to go somewhere to receive help. A rehabilitation center. It's akin to a hospital. The more he spoke, the less I comprehended. But she was bleeding. Where did you take her? The weight of confusion pressed down on me. No, Paul, he replied sharply. She wasn't bleeding. But you, I fumbled. No, Paul, no, he shouted. Mom is fine, she merely had to go away for a bit. Frustration clouded his voice. She needed to go away, he repeated. So when someone asks you where your mother is, what will you tell them? He was fixated on me now. I reflected for a moment. I tell them she had to go away for a little while. Yes, Paul, that's correct. He enveloped me in his arms, forcing an embrace. That's right, son. Mom just had to go away for a little while, and that's all we know. After he departed the room, I lingered a bit longer before standing shakily and leaving the front door. I settled on the damp concrete slab, unsure if I should cry. Confusion overwhelmed me. I wasn't entirely certain what had occurred, but I wished to have faith in my father. If he spoke the truth, then Mom would be all right. The rain had ceased, but clouds still loomed overhead. At that moment, I heard a soft tap on the concrete beside me. I turned my head to see the most beautiful bluebird. I awoke drenched in sweat. I was in the living room chair where I had been when the angel had touched me. Jane still lay curled up on the couch. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It was 5:50 a.m. Day 5, Thursday. When my alarm chimed at 5:55 a.m., I silenced it and roused Jane. What's happening? She asked, shielding her ears with a pillow. We need to hide. This is when it always transpires. Confused but terrified, she sat up, scanning the surroundings. Where should we conceal ourselves? Panic edged into her voice, and while I wanted to provide comfort, I was honestly terrified myself. The pantry, I exclaimed, pointing toward the kitchen. We scrambled to the door and concealed ourselves just as a thunderous sound startled us. As we closed the door, agonizing roars erupted from the basement. Clinging to each other, we held our breath, neither daring to exhale too loudly. The pounding of heavy footsteps ascended the stairs, accompanied by hate-filled howls. Through the slits in the pantry door, I caught sight of a massive black likeness launching itself from the top step into the living room, black sludge oozing onto all surfaces as it frantically searched the room. It clutched my rolled-up rug from the basement, though this time it appeared a bit thicker. The creature slammed the rug onto the living room floor and fled down the stairs on all fours, screaming. After a few moments, we cautiously emerged from the pantry. The monster was nowhere to be heard, and we struggled to catch our breath. I dashed to the living room, needing to determine what lay within that rug. A gut feeling compelled me to believe it would reveal the decayed body of my mother. Yet when I unrolled it, she was not inside. Instead, my sweet grandma lay there, cold and lifeless. A sob escaped my lips. Tears streamed down my face as I initiated CPR 30 compressions and 2 breaths, I remembered. But it was futile. My grandmother, the woman who had cared for me throughout my life, the only pillar of stability I'd ever known, lay lifeless in the living room. At the funeral a few days later, Jane held me tightly as we wept together. I was utterly devastated. I had never experienced death sting as profoundly as this. I had attended funerals in the past, and they were sorrowful, but this felt entirely different. Death didn't merely take a life from me, it ripped away my whole heart. Could I genuinely state that death claimed my grandmother? Certainly, death may have hovered in the background, but what truly took her was my past. Had I remembered my father's actions toward my mother sooner, could all of this have been avoided? Did it require the loss of my cherished matriarch to reveal the truth? These are inquiries I fear will forever go unanswered. Everything unraveled the moment my grandmother was taken from me. As they prepared to lower the casket, a small bluebird perched near the grave's head. It seemed to bow in solemnity. As we walked back to our car, Jane broke the silence. I haven't smoked in years, but I think I will need a cigarette today. Would you like one? She produced a pack I was unaware she had purchased. No thanks, I replied. My dad used to smoke 2 packs a day.